Margaret Chen was the kind of neighbor everyone loved having on their street. She was 52 years old, always wore comfortable cardigans and simple dresses, and had this gentle way about her that made people feel at ease. Every morning she'd be out in her small front garden, carefully tending to her flowers and plants like they were her children. The roses were her pride and joy, but she also had these beautiful orchids that she'd somehow managed to keep alive in a climate they weren't really meant for. The thing about Margaret was that she genuinely cared about people. On weekends, she volunteered at the community center, teaching Tai Chi to seniors. She'd bring homemade cookies to new neighbors, and during the holidays, her house always smelled like fresh baking. Kids in the neighborhood knew her as the nice lady who'd give them cold lemonade on hot summer days. She never raised her voice, never complained, and always had a kind word for everyone. What nobody in Willow Creek subdivision knew was that Margaret had lived a completely different life before moving there 3 years ago. For 30 years, she'd lived in Japan, training in a traditional karate school. She'd wake up at 5 every morning, practice for hours, and eventually earned her 5th-degree black belt. It wasn't just about fighting for her. It was about discipline, respect, and inner peace. When her master passed away and she decided to retire, Margaret chose the quietest, most peaceful place she could find. She wanted a simple life away from everything she'd known. She never talked about her past, and honestly, nobody ever asked. Everything was peaceful until Derek Thornton showed up. Derek moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago, and within 2 weeks he'd somehow talked his way into becoming the HOA president. He was one of those guys who'd had some big corporate job and acted like he was still running a Fortune 500 company. Tall, loud, always wearing expensive polo shirts. And he had this way of looking at people like they were beneath him. The first HOA meeting he ran, he spent 2 hours talking about maintaining standards and protecting property values. Most people just nodded along, wanting to get home. Margaret attended that meeting too, sitting quietly in the back row. She believed in being a good neighbor, following the rules and keeping the peace. When Derek laid out all these new regulations, she figured they were probably necessary. After all, she was new to American suburban life. Maybe this was just how things worked here. The first violation notice came on a Tuesday morning. Margaret found it tucked into her mailbox, printed on official-looking letterhead. Apparently, her trash cans had been visible from the street for approximately 15 minutes past the allowed time. The fine was $50. Margaret read it twice, confused. She'd brought the cans in as soon as she got home from her volunteering, but maybe she'd been a few minutes late. She didn't want to cause any trouble, so she wrote a check and dropped it off at Derek's house with a handwritten note apologizing. Derek answered the door, looked at the check, and gave her the smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he said. "I'm glad you understand we take our rules seriously here." He didn't invite her in or acknowledge her apology, just took the check and closed the door. A week later, another notice. This time, her mailbox was apparently positioned 2 inches outside the approved boundary line. Another $50 fine. Margaret measured it herself with a tape measure, and honestly, she couldn't see how 2 inches made any real difference. But again, she paid. She didn't want problems. She'd spent her whole life learning that sometimes you just let small things go to keep the peace. Then came the notice about her flowers. Apparently, the pink roses she'd so carefully cultivated were non-approved colors for front yard plantings. The approved colors were red, white, or yellow only. The fine was $100 this time. Margaret stood in her garden looking at her roses, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. These roses had taken her 2 years to grow. But she took a deep breath, centered herself the way her master had taught her, and paid the fine. Other neighbors started getting notices too. Old Mr. Peterson got fined because his garden gnome was considered visual clutter. The Ramirez family got hit with a violation for parking their car facing the wrong direction in their own driveway. Even sweet Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived there for 20 years, got fined for having a welcome mat that was the wrong shade of brown. People started avoiding HOA meetings. When they saw Derek coming down the street, they'd suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. Margaret noticed, but she kept to herself, kept paying her fines, kept smiling and being polite. She'd left her old life behind for a reason. Whatever this was, it would pass. She just needed to stay calm, follow the rules, and everything would be fine. That's what she told herself anyway as she wrote another check for another violation. Her car had been parked at a non-regulation angle in her own driveway. $150. Margaret looked at the notice for a long time before writing that check. Her hands were steady, her face was calm, but somewhere deep inside, something very old and very disciplined was starting to wake up. The monthly HOA meeting fell on a Thursday evening, and Margaret decided to attend. She'd been paying fines for 2 months straight, and while she didn't want to cause trouble, she thought maybe she could politely ask about some of the rules. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. Perhaps if she just explained things calmly, Derek would ease up a bit. The meeting was held in the community center, the same place where Margaret taught her Tai Chi classes. About 15 neighbors showed up, which was half the usual number. People were tired of Derek's meetings, tired of his rules, tired of walking on eggshells in their own neighborhood. Margaret sat in her usual spot in the back, waiting patiently through 45 minutes of Derek talking about lawn maintenance standards and proper holiday decoration timelines. Finally, when he asked if anyone had questions, she raised her hand. Yes? Derek pointed at her, and there was something in his tone that made a few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. I was just wondering, Margaret said softly, about the flower color restrictions. I've been growing roses for many years, and the pink variety does very well in this climate. Is there perhaps some flexibility with the color rules? Derek stared at her for a moment, then let out a short laugh. The rules are the rules, Mrs. Chen. They're written clearly in the HOA guidelines. Pink is not an approved color. If you can't follow simple instructions, maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you. The room went silent. A few people looked down at their laps. Margaret felt her face grow warm, but she kept her voice steady. I understand. I just thought perhaps we could discuss. There's nothing to discuss, Derek cut her off. You've already received multiple violations. Honestly, at this point, I'm questioning whether you're capable of maintaining our community standards. Margaret nodded slowly and didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. When it ended, Mrs. Patterson touched her arm gently in the parking lot. Don't let him get to you, dear, the older woman whispered. He's like this with everyone. But Margaret noticed that Derek wasn't like this with everyone. He seemed to have a special focus on her, and over the next few weeks that became crystal clear. The violations came faster now, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. Her doormat was the wrong texture. Her house numbers needed repainting even though they'd just been painted 6 months ago. The small bird feeder in her backyard was apparently visible from the street if you stood at just the right angle, and that was a violation. Each fine was larger than the last. Margaret paid them all. She removed the bird feeder. She bought a new doormat. She repainted her house numbers. But it was never enough. Then one Saturday morning she heard loud voices outside. She looked out her window and saw Derek standing in her driveway with 2 other men. They were big guys, probably in their 30s, and they had the same aggressive energy that Derek had. Later, she'd learned they were his brothers visiting for the weekend. Margaret opened her door before they could knock. Good morning, she said pleasantly. Can I help you? HOA inspection, Derek announced, waving a clipboard. We need to check your backyard for violations. Of course, Margaret said, stepping aside. Would you like some lemonade? It's quite warm today. Derek ignored her offer and pushed past her, his brothers following. Margaret walked behind them calmly, her hands clasped in front of her. She watched as they went through her small backyard, pointing at things, taking photos, writing notes. Her heart was beating faster than normal, but her breathing remained steady. Old training kicked in without her even thinking about it. These stones, Derek said, pointing at the small rock garden she'd created in the corner. What are these? It's a Zen garden, Margaret explained quietly. It helps me meditate. It's clutter, Derek said flatly. He stepped into it deliberately, his heavy boot crushing the carefully raked patterns. Unapproved yard decoration. Margaret watched the stones scatter. She'd arranged them that morning like she did every morning. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, but she kept them still. I see, she said. Then Derek walked over to her orchids. These were her most precious plants, the ones she'd brought with her from Japan, the ones she'd somehow kept alive for 3 years in a climate they weren't meant for. They were blooming beautifully, delicate purple flowers that seemed almost too perfect to be real. And these? Derek asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew what he was going to say. Those are orchids, Margaret said, and for the first time her voice had an edge to it. Please be careful around them. Derek looked right at her and then he stepped directly onto the flowers. Not accidentally, Not carelessly. Deliberately. His boot came down on the blooms, crushing them into the dirt. Then he ground his heel, making sure they were completely destroyed. "Oops," he said, smirking. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Not from fear. Not from sadness. From the sheer effort of keeping herself still. Of keeping herself from reacting. Every muscle in her body knew exactly what to do. Knew exactly how to respond to aggression. To someone invading her space. To someone deliberately trying to provoke her. 30 years of training hummed just beneath her skin like electricity. But she breathed. She centered herself. She thought of her master's words. True strength is knowing when not to fight. "I'll need to write you up for these orchids anyway," Derek continued, making notes on his clipboard. "Non-approved species. The fine will be $300. He looked up at her, his brothers flanking him like guards. "You know, Mrs. Chen, I'm starting to think you're more trouble than you're worth to this community." Margaret met his eyes, and something in her gaze made him blink first, though he covered it with another smirk. "I'll pay the fine," she said quietly. "Yeah, you will," Derek said. He handed her the violation notice, and as he walked away, he deliberately kicked over her small watering can. Water spilled across the patio. Margaret stood there long after they left, looking at her crushed orchids, her hands still trembling with restraint. Mrs. Patterson had been watching from her window and came over as soon as Derek drove away. "Oh, honey," she said, seeing the destroyed flowers. "I'm so sorry." Margaret knelt down, trying to salvage what she could, but the orchids were beyond saving. "It's okay," she said softly, though her voice cracked slightly. "They're just flowers, but they weren't just flowers. They were the last connection to her old life, to the person she used to be. And Derek had destroyed them just to prove he could." That night, Margaret sat in her living room in the dark, looking at her hands. She'd kept them soft all these years, hidden what they could do. But those hands remembered everything. 2 weeks after the orchid incident, Margaret received a formal letter in the mail. It was printed on expensive paper with the HOA seal at the top. Derek had called an emergency meeting, and the subject line made her stomach drop. "Discussion regarding 347 Maple Drive property concerns." That was her address. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening. Margaret read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what was happening. At the bottom, in small print, it mentioned that the board would be reviewing whether the property meets community standards and discussing potential remediation options. She showed the letter to Mrs. Patterson, who went pale. "Oh no," the older woman said. "He's trying to force you out. I've heard of HOAs doing this. They declare a property a nuisance, make life so difficult that people have no choice but to sell." "But I've paid every fine," Margaret said quietly. "I've followed every rule." "It doesn't matter to someone like Derek," Mrs. Patterson said sadly. "He's decided he doesn't like you, and now he's going to make an example of you." Margaret didn't sleep much the next few nights. She'd moved to Willow Creek for peace, for a quiet life. She'd left everything behind in Japan. All her accomplishments, all her identity as a martial artist. She just wanted to grow her flowers and live simply. The thought of being driven from her home felt unbearable. Tuesday evening came too quickly. Margaret dressed in a simple blue cardigan and arrived at the community center 15 minutes early. She was surprised to see the room was nearly full. Word had spread about what Derek was planning, and people had shown up, some out of curiosity, some out of concern, and a few, like Mrs. Patterson, out of support. Derek sat at the front table with 2 other board members who looked uncomfortable. He'd prepared a presentation with printed photos and documents in neat folders. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a performance. "Thank you all for coming," Derek began, standing up with the confidence of someone who'd already won. "Tonight we're addressing a serious issue that affects our entire community. The property at 347 Maple Drive has become a recurring problem." He clicked through a slideshow on the projector. Photos of Margaret's house appeared, but they looked wrong. The angles were strange, the lighting manipulated. Her garden looked overgrown and messy, though she knew it wasn't. Her mailbox looked crooked, though it stood straight. The photos had been edited, changed to make everything look worse than it was. "As you can see," Derek continued, "this property has consistently failed to meet our standards. Despite numerous violations and warnings, the owner has shown a pattern of disregard for our community guidelines." Margaret sat perfectly still in the 3rd row, her hands folded in her lap. People kept glancing at her, but she didn't react. She just listened. "I've also received complaints from neighbors," Derek said, though he didn't specify which neighbors. "Concerns about property values, about the appearance of our street, about whether this homeowner is truly committed to our community standards." He went on like this for 20 minutes. Every small violation was presented as a major offense. The pink roses became evidence of willful disregard for regulations. The orchids, now dead and removed, were somehow still a problem because they'd existed in the first place. Even the timing of when she brought in her trash cans was analyzed like a crime. Margaret noticed that Derek never said her name. He kept saying the homeowner or this property, like she wasn't a person, just a problem to be solved. Finally, Derek paused and looked directly at her. "Mrs. Chen, you're welcome to respond to these concerns." Margaret stood slowly. Every eye in the room turned to her. She walked to the front, her movements calm and measured. She didn't bring any papers or photos. She just stood there, small and quiet, facing a room full of people. "I moved here 3 years ago," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I chose this neighborhood because it seemed peaceful. I've tried very hard to be a good neighbor. I've paid every fine, even when I didn't understand them. I've changed everything I was asked to change." She paused, looking around the room. "I just want to live in my home and tend my garden. That's all I've ever wanted." "That's very touching," Derek said with fake sympathy. "But the question isn't about what you want. It's about what's best for the community." "And you think forcing me out is best for the community?" Margaret asked, still speaking gently. "I think maintaining our standards is what's best," Derek replied. "If you can't meet those standards, then yes, perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right place for you." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Patterson stood up. "This is ridiculous, Derek. You've been targeting this poor woman since—" "Please sit down," Derek cut her off. "You'll have a chance to speak during the public comment period." Margaret looked at Derek for a long moment. She could see it in his eyes. He'd already made up his mind. This whole meeting was just theater, a way to humiliate her publicly before pushing her out. She'd seen bullies before, in dojos, in competitions, in life. They all had the same look when they thought they'd won. "I will not be leaving my home," Margaret said quietly but firmly. "Thank you for your time." She walked back to her seat. Derek smiled, like her defiance was exactly what he'd wanted. "We'll take a vote next week," he announced, "on whether to declare 347 Maple Drive a community nuisance and begin remediation proceedings." The meeting dragged on for another hour, but Margaret barely heard it. She knew what was coming. Derek would win his vote. He'd stack the deck, pressure the board members, and she'd be forced to either sell or face endless legal battles. When the meeting finally ended, people filtered out into the parking lot. Margaret walked slowly to her car, exhausted emotionally in a way she hadn't felt in years. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Derek approaching, his 2 brothers flanking him again. They'd been sitting in the back during the meeting. "Mrs. Chen," Derek called out, his voice echoing across the parking lot. "Got a minute?" Margaret stopped by her car. Several people were still in the parking lot getting into their vehicles, but no one was close. The overhead lights cast long shadows. "I want you to understand something," Derek said, walking up until he was standing way too close to her. "You're going to lose. You're going to sell that house, probably at a loss, and you're going to leave. That's how this ends." Margaret didn't step back. "Please move," she said quietly. "Or what?" Derek laughed. His brothers moved closer, one on each side. "What are you going to do, old lady? Call the police? Tell them the HOA president was mean to you? Please step back," Margaret repeated, her voice even softer now. Derek leaned in even closer, invading her space, his face inches from hers. "Make me," he whispered, and for the first time in 3 years, Margaret stopped trying to be someone she wasn't. What happened next took less than 10 seconds, but everyone who saw it would remember it for the rest of their lives. Derek's hand moved toward Margaret's shoulder, reaching out to grab her or push her or intimidate her further. Nobody was quite sure what he intended, but his hand never made contact. Margaret moved so smoothly it almost didn't look like movement at all. One moment Derek was leaning forward, aggressive and confident. The next moment he was rotating, his own momentum working against him, and suddenly he was face down on the pavement with his arm extended behind him at an angle that looked uncomfortable, but not painful. Margaret held him there with one hand, barely any pressure, just perfect positioning. Her other hand rested gently on his shoulder blade. She wasn't hurting him. She was simply controlling him completely. I asked you to step back, she said quietly. The parking lot went dead silent. Derek's brothers stared for one frozen second, then both moved forward at the same time. They were big guys, used to being intimidating, used to people backing down. Margaret released Derek and stood up. She didn't raise her hands in a fighting stance. She didn't look aggressive. She just adjusted her footing slightly, her weight settling in a way that looked natural but wasn't. The first brother reached for her arm. Margaret turned her body and his hand found nothing but air. His own forward motion carried him past her, and she guided him gently but firmly using his momentum. He stumbled sideways, caught himself on the hood of a car looking shocked. The second brother was smarter. He stopped, held up his hands. Whoa, okay. Derek scrambled to his feet, his face bright red. Margaret could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He'd just been humiliated in front of witnesses. His brothers had been made to look foolish. His whole tough guy image had shattered in seconds. You assaulted me, Derek shouted, loud enough for everyone in the parking lot to hear. Did everyone see that? She attacked me. Actually, a voice called out, I got the whole thing on video. Everyone turned. A younger woman, maybe 30, was standing by her car holding up her phone. Her name was Jennifer, and she lived 3 houses down from Margaret. I started recording when you cornered her, Jennifer said. It shows pretty clearly that you got in her space and reached for her first. Derek's face went from red to purple. Give me that phone. Not a chance, Jennifer said, taking a step back. I'm already uploading it to the cloud. Margaret stood quietly, her hands at her sides, breathing normally. The adrenaline that would have flooded most people wasn't there. She'd been in situations like this before years ago in training. Her body knew what to do and her mind stayed calm. I trained in karate for 30 years, Margaret said, speaking to everyone now, not just Derek. In Japan, I earned my 5th degree black belt when I was 45. I came here because I was tired of that life. I wanted peace. I wanted to grow flowers and be a good neighbor. She looked at Derek and her voice remained gentle. I never wanted to use what I learned. I still don't. But I also won't be bullied anymore. Derek pointed at her, his hand shaking. You're done. You're finished in this neighborhood. I'll have you arrested for assault. I'll sue you. You'll do nothing. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the night. She'd walked over from her car, and several other neighbors had gathered around. We all saw what happened. You threatened her. You invaded her space. Your brothers tried to intimidate her. She defended herself and she didn't even hurt any of you. She could have, Jennifer added, still holding her phone. I've seen enough martial arts to know she was holding back a lot. If she'd wanted to hurt you, you'd be on your way to the hospital right now. More neighbors spoke up. People who'd been silent for months, too afraid to stand up to Derek, suddenly found their voices. They talked about the unfair fines, the bullying tactics, the way he'd made everyone miserable. It all came pouring out like water breaking through a dam. Through it all, Margaret just stood quietly by her car. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't gloating. If anything, she looked sad. This wasn't who she wanted to be anymore. She'd spent 3 years building a peaceful life, and in 10 seconds, she'd had to tear down that facade. Derek looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him, at his brothers who were keeping their distance now, at Jennifer still recording everything on her phone. He'd lost and he knew it. This isn't over, he said, but his voice had lost its power. He sounded like what he really was. A bully who'd finally been stood up to. I think it is, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, and I'll be calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow to discuss your behavior tonight and your conduct as HOA president. Derek got into his truck, his brothers following in their own vehicle. As they drove away, the neighbors gathered around Margaret. Some wanted to shake her hand. Some wanted to apologize for not standing up to Derek sooner. Jennifer showed her the video she'd recorded. Margaret watched herself on the phone screen. The movements looked effortless, natural, like she'd simply stepped aside and Derek had fallen on his own, which in a way he had. That was the beauty of good technique. You didn't fight against someone's force. You just redirected it. Are you okay? Mrs. Patterson asked, touching Margaret's arm. Margaret nodded, but she felt tears in her eyes. I just wanted to grow my flowers, she said softly. I didn't want any of this. I know, honey, Mrs. Patterson said. But sometimes peaceful people have to show they're not helpless. There's a difference. The crowd eventually dispersed, people heading to their cars and their homes. Jennifer promised to send Margaret a copy of the video and to make sure it was properly backed up in case Derek tried something legal. Margaret sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, steady and calm. These hands had trained for 3 decades. They'd broken boards, defended against attacks, performed katas thousands of times. She'd hidden them away, tried to make them soft and harmless. But tonight they'd remembered what they were made for. Not for violence, not for showing off, but for standing up when standing up was necessary. She drove home slowly, parked in her driveway at exactly the right angle, and walked into her quiet house. In the living room, she had a box in the closet that she hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside was her black belt, her certificates, photos from her time in Japan. Margaret pulled out the belt and held it, running her fingers over the worn fabric. Tomorrow she'd hang it on the wall, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a reminder to herself that you could be gentle and still be strong. You could want peace and still stand your ground. She made herself tea and sat by the window looking out at her garden. The orchids were gone, but roses were resilient. They'd grow back. Everything would grow back given time and care, and this time she wouldn't hide who she was.